In this video, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the portrait of Jesus that is presented to us in Mark's Gospel. So, in other words, thinking the portrait of Jesus, it's also this idea of Mark's Christology. So, I'm using the metaphor of portrait because portrait is probably a closer resemblance to what we're seeing in Mark's Gospel rather than a picture. When you think of a picture, you think maybe of a camera that takes a photo of exactly what it is you are seeing. But with a portrait, you have more of an artistic representation of what it is a person sees or thinks. And so what we're seeing in Mark's Gospel is his portrait, his artistic representation of Jesus as he has gathered information from different sources. So if Mark's Gospel was composed by John Mark, as tradition holds, and he's gotten information from eyewitnesses. He himself may not have been an eyewitness of Jesus. We don't know. But if he's gotten information from apostles and from others, and he has these traditions that have come through the different communities, and he has woven these together in order to present Jesus as he should be understood by his intended audience, assuming Mark's audience is primarily Gentiles. So Jesus is, one thing, for Mark, Jesus is a teacher, a didaskalos. It is a frequent description in Mark's gospel, even though Mark has less of Jesus' teachings than the other gospels. So certainly seeing Jesus as a teacher is an approved description of Jesus, since Jesus uses it for himself. So Jesus sees in Mark 14:14 that he is a teacher. So calling Jesus a teacher, or thinking about Jesus as a teacher, is an appropriate way. Yet it is used by those who do not comprehend Jesus's true significance. In other words, the people that we see calling Jesus a teacher are people like Jewish opponents. We see blind Bartimaeus calling him a teacher, and Judas the apostle calls Jesus teacher. And so it's interesting that these people who don't really have a full comprehension of him use this title. So it may be a legitimate title, but it may not be a complete understanding of him. The metaphor of blind, like with blind Bartimaeus, blindness oftentimes is a symbol of ignorance, not being able to clearly see. And so Bartimaeus, in his blindness, sees Jesus as a teacher. But Jesus is more than a teacher, though it's legitimate to think of him that way. Jesus is also a prophet. This description is used less than the term teacher is, but it is legitimate since Jesus describes himself as a prophet. And so seeing him as someone who speaks forth God's word, someone who declares God's word to others. While some Jews are willing to recognize Jesus as a prophet, Peter's confession in Mark 8:29 indicates that it is not sufficient. Other people think of Jesus as a prophet, think of him as one of the prophets. And then when Jesus asks the question, but who do you think that I am? Then Peter's response is going to indicate that the idea of Jesus being a prophet is not sufficient. So, of course, the more important title or designation is Jesus as the Anointed One, or as the Christos. It is a title that is used less than teacher, again, but because of its use in Peter's confession, it's elevated as more significant. So people might think of Jesus as a prophet, but ultimately, the fact that it was revealed to Peter that Jesus is the Christ, and he declares that, then that's a much more significant understanding of Jesus. While it often appears with different qualifiers, such as Son of God, so Christ, the Son of God, or Christ, Son of Man. while Jesus accepts Peter's identification of himself as Messiah, he never uses it of himself. So this is really a very interesting thing that um, Jesus never says, actually, in any of the Gospels, not just Mark, he never says, I am the Christ. Now, um, and like in John's Gospel, he might affirm when the Samaritan woman says that, the Christ is to come, and he'll say something like, I am he. But he'll never use the expression, I am the Christ. Now, we don't know if this is part of this kind of secrecy motif that's been recognized in Mark's gospel, where he tells people not to tell anybody else his identity. So, but it's a curious thing, and there's been kind of scholarly interest in trying to understand why the words, I am the Christ, is not used in the gospel as coming from the lips of Jesus. Now, in John's gospel, again, there are people who claim that Jesus said, I am the Christ, but in the narrative, it doesn't appear. Jesus commands humans and demons to be silent. And so this is part of the secrecy motif. It's, telling them not to reveal something about his identity. Jesus discloses his identity, being the Christ, or affirming it here kind of privately to the disciples. And Jesus' parables are also designed to conceal the truth. So, these are aspects of what is oftentimes seen as the secrecy motif in Mark's gospel. Sometimes people may wonder, if Jesus was afraid that, they think that, the reason why Jesus didn't say that he was the Christ has been that maybe Jesus was afraid that people might misunderstand his role as the Messiah, since many people thought of the Messiah as leading this kind of revolution, and Jesus is not doing that, that there might be this misunderstanding. So, but I mean, the problem with that view is, Jesus could simply have stressed that he was a different kind of Messiah, which he does do with his disciples. So, why can't you go ahead and why couldn't you have just gone ahead and say, I am the Christ, and then explain, but I'm not the Christ you're kind of expecting? And Jesus does seem to accept in Mark's gospel different groups recognizing him as the Messiah. He kind of accepts those claims. So that's a curious thing. We also see in Mark's gospel Jesus identified as the Son of Man. It appears exclusively on the lips of Jesus as a self-designation. Now, I have listed here several places where there is thought of as self-designation. I would just say this about the phrase Son of Man. It's much more complicated than what I'm presenting here. There's been a lot of scholarly work trying to understand how it was used. I basically see that the phrase Son of Man had 4 different usages. At the time that Jesus lived, could be used by any Jew to refer to themselves. So as Jesus does, we have a rabbinic text, although so this dates later than the time of Jesus, but it might reflect earlier traditions of a rabbi who uses Son of Man to talk about himself. He makes the statement, if the Son of Man had been on Mount Sinai when Torah was given, he would have asked the Lord for 2 mouths. And what the rabbi means by that is the reason he wants 2 mouths is because he could use 1 mouth to study Torah all the time, and then he could have another mouth to teach Torah, or he needs to eat, or needs to do anything else with his mouth. So basically, he is saying, I would have done something that Moses didn't do. If I were receiving Torah, I would have asked for an additional mouth so I could continue to study the law all the time. So, Son of Man could be used by a Jew to refer to themselves. But it's also, of course, a figure that we see in the book of Daniel. Now, in the book of Daniel, Son of Man refers to is a way of referring to all the um, people of God. They are collectively, Israel is collectively is the Son of Man who receives the kingdom. But they're also developed, and we see this in evidence such as First Enoch, kind of an apocalyptic figure. He's an eschatological figure who comes and brings vindication and judgment. So, um, so there's this view that existed of this person coming at the end of time, to announce, God's judgment and to vindicate the righteous. So we see that as well as another option. So the circumlocution, self-reference, is one way. Israel is another way. Now, the other way that's used, and maybe one of these examples here might reflect this fourth option, and that is it can be used for any human being. So a son of man can be any person. So, for instance, we have the phrase that's used in the Psalms, what is man that thou art mindful of him, the son of man that you would consider him. So there, parallelism, Hebrew parallelism, a son of man equals man or equals human being. So when Jesus says something like that the Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath, therefore the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, there, Son of Man might mean, and would make more sense, that the Son of Man refers to human beings. Human beings, a person, is Lord over the Sabbath, how the Sabbath can serve them, can serve their need for rest. So anyway, just saying this, that primarily it's used as this kind of self designation for Jesus. It is used in association then with the theme of suffering and death, which, in contrast to how Son of Man was used by other Jews to talk about this, the semi-divine eschatological figure who comes at the end of time, who conquers or who has power. Here, this Son of Man, Jesus, is going to come with suffering and with death. So we have Son of Man. Now, another important Christological view is Jesus as Son of God. So it's considered by many to be the most important messianic title in Mark. It appears in key moments, so we have it at the very beginning of his Gospels, and so we have it at his baptism, transfiguration, and so even at his crucifixion. So Son of God is found in a lot of different important places. So God says of Jesus at his baptism that this is his beloved Son. So we don't have the phrase Son of God, but we do have this is my beloved Son. So that language. It's said at his transfiguration. And it seems to be as well kind of a self-designation. When Jesus can talk about himself as the Son. So this representative of him. So there is little evidence previously within Judaism to show that the Son of God was a title for the Messiah, and so that's kind of interesting that here. But what should be noted, I think, is the Roman context for this phrase, Son of God, because since the Roman emperors were thought of as Son of God, this is a title as well for the emperors. It begins with Augustus, as he was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and after Julius Caesar was killed, he was then divinized. In other words, he became, in the minds of the people, a god. And since Augustus is his son, and Caesar is a god, so Caesar is son of God. And after the death of each emperor becomes a god. And so the person who takes over from them, it becomes that person's son. And so the emperors are linked with the divine. So calling Jesus Son of God is, in one sense, connecting him with some kind of authority in the Roman context. So even though there's little evidence within Judaism that Son of God was a title for the Messiah, it is conducive with the idea of the Messiah being a king or being a ruler, and somehow or another being, kind of connected, as it were, with God. Of course, David is a son of God. Adam is son of God, and human beings can be son of God. So if David can be a son of God, the idea that the Messiah is the son of God seems to be a kind of a natural direction for this. According to William Telford, it is more closely akin to the concept of a theos aner. So this is a divine man, and who's endowed with supernatural power and authority. So this is a figure we find in Greek literature of a figure who's very powerful. Of course, Jesus is powerful. He performs miracles. He does mighty things. And Jesus is a person of authority. So for Telford, this is where we should be looking for the background for this phrase, Son of God, as a person of power and authority. The major Christology of Mark's Gospel is Jesus as the supernatural, hidden Son of God, who must come to suffer and die a redemptive death. So, in other words, this is a part of this portrait that this idea of suffering and dying for redemption, suffering and dying to bring benefit, suffering and dying as a part of his obedience to God, carrying out God's purposes in the world. In a sense, providing a model for disciples to follow suit, follow in the same way. I'll just end here with a quite little aside here about, is the author of Mark's Gospel intentionally downplaying an early triumphalist Christology that focused on Jesus as Son of David? So if Jesus was known as Son of David before Mark's Gospel was written, the idea of Son of David may have this idea of coming with power, setting up an earthly kingdom, which Jesus did not do. So if there were people who were thinking Jesus is the Son of David, well, wait a minute, where is this kingdom that the Son of David was supposed to set up? And Son of David is a language or a title of Jesus that doesn't get as much play in Mark's Gospel as it does, say, for instance, in Matthew's Gospel. So we have a blind Bartimaeus who calls him Son of David, but again, the idea of being blind, idea of ignorance, not completely understanding. We have his triumphal entry amongst the crowd. So this is going to be the same crowd that in Mark's Gospel is going to turn on Jesus very soon. But when he rides on the donkey coming into Jerusalem, the crowds who may not completely understand call him as a son of David, because Jesus, in a sense, is acting like a kingly figure by staging, as it were, this particular activity. And we do see a dispute with his opponents about if Jesus is the son of David. So this kind of question about him. Jesus doesn't deny being son of David, but it shows an area of misunderstanding or not complete understanding from his opponents. I'll just say this one last thing about Son of David. One thing that Mark's Gospel does not do, if he does accept Son of David as a legitimate way of referring to Jesus, he does not try to link this title in any way with a genealogy. So there's no genealogy in Mark's Gospel trying to show Jesus as physically descendant from David. If Jesus is the Messiah, then ipso facto, he is the son of David. It doesn't matter what his bloodline is. The Messiah is going to be David's son. So we will leave that as a brief little introduction into the portrait of Jesus that is presented to us in Mark's Gospel.